chains of fate. The auction hall buzzed with an unsettling energy, the kind that clung to the air like a thick fog. It was a place where lives were traded for credits, where beings of all races were reduced to mere commodities. Flickering overhead lights cast a pale glow on the grim faces of the audience, merchants, slavers, and opportunists who thrived on the suffering of others. The room smelled of stale sweat and burning metal, a pungent reminder of the inhumanity that often accompanied such dealings. In the center of the stage stood Nera, her silver-gray skin marked with bruises from weeks of abuse. Despite the heavy chains that bound her wrists and ankles, she held herself with an air of defiance. Her sharp emerald eyes scanned the room, observing every face, every movement. Her kind, that Island, were known for their intelligence and elegance, but here none of that mattered. She was nothing more than an object up for sale. The auctioneer's voice rang out like a cracked bell, his words dripping with fake enthusiasm. Feast your eyes on this rare gem, Island. Unmatched in intelligence and strength, perfect for any task, from service to labor. He paused for effect, letting the room digest his words. Starting bid, 10,000 credits. Nera's heart beat faster, not with fear, but with a quiet, burning resolve. She wouldn't let them see her break. She wouldn't let them know how close she was to surrender. But the auction had begun, and the numbers climbed with relentless speed. 15,000, 20,000, 30,000 credits. Then, a voice cut through the rising tide of bids, calm and unwavering. 50,000 credits. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the source of the bid. A man stood in the shadows, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. Captain Elias Kane. To most, he was just another shadow among shadows. Unremarkable, a stranger in a room full of predators. But his eyes, they held something different. Not greed, not malice, but something else. Something that Nera hadn't seen in a long time. Compassion. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, but his greed quickly resurfaced. 50,000 credits. Do I hear 55,000? The crowd shifted uneasily, but Elias didn't flinch. He stood still, waiting, unyielding. The bidding war didn't last long. The brutish thug in the front row, a scared figure with a face twisted into a permanent sneer, hesitated. Even he knew that 50,000 was too high for most of the bidders in the room. Sold, the auctioneer said, his voice tinged with reluctant satisfaction. The gavel came down with a resounding crack. Elias approached the stage. His gaze met Nera's for the first time, and for a brief moment, she saw something, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He spoke, his voice low enough only for her to hear. I'm getting you out of here. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. Nera's eyes narrowed, suspicion and defiance mixing in the emerald depths. I don't owe you anything, she said sharply. Elias didn't respond with words. Instead, he moved quickly, unlocking her chains with practiced precision. As the iron fell away, Nera felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom. Freedom that she knew would be short-lived if they didn't act quickly. She could already hear the sound of boots in the distance, the thugs who had sold her now enraged by her escape. Before she could say anything, Elias placed a hand on her arm, guiding her away from the stage. Let's go. They're coming for us. Nera didn't resist. For the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope. Small, fragile, but real. As they moved toward the exit, Nera glanced over her shoulder. The brute, the one who had bid for her, was not far behind, followed by a few others. His eyes burned with fury. Nera grinned. They're coming for us, she said, her tone cold but tinged with excitement. Elias pulled a blaster from his belt, the soft hum of it filling the space between them. Let them come, he replied, his voice calm, almost detached. Together, they stepped into the neon-lit streets, where the dangers of the city waited. The pursuit had begun, but so had something else. A new chapter in Nera's life. A chapter that would test her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend, but one that also held the promise of something far greater than mere survival. Freedom. The chase had started, and Nira would make sure it was one the slavers would never forget. The escape and the pursuit. The city was alive with energy, a throbbing pulse of neon lights and towering spires. But beneath the vibrant surface, darkness lingered in the shadows of the alleyways. The hum of the bustling metropolis was drowned out by the pounding of footsteps that echoed through the narrow streets. Nira and Elias moved swiftly, their every step quick and deliberate. Nira's chains had fallen away, but she was still bound by the uncertainty of her new reality. Elias didn't speak much as they ran, his focus solely on the path ahead. He had clearly done this before, navigating the labyrinthine alleys of the city with ease. But Nira wasn't entirely sure what to make of him. She had seen men like him before, mercenaries, soldiers, or just those willing to help for the right price. She wasn't ready to trust him, no matter how kind his actions seemed. As they rounded a corner, a burst of light illuminated the street ahead. A group of figures, silhouettes bathed in harsh neon, stood at the end of the alley. They were closing in fast, too fast. The brute who had bid for Nira in the auction was leading the pack, his broad frame an imposing figure in the night. Nira's sharp eyes caught sight of them first. "They're gaining on us," she murmured, her tone cool, though her heart beat faster in her chest. Elias didn't flinch. His face remained unreadable, his movements purposeful. He glanced at Nira for a split second. "Don't worry," he said, his voice calm but low, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "They'll follow us right into a trap." Nira felt a surge of unease but didn't question him. Instead, she kept her focus on the alley ahead, scanning for any exit or escape route. But there were none. The only way out was to keep moving, faster, harder. The group behind them was now just a few blocks away. Nira could hear the thumping of their boots, a rhythmic sound that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. The brute shouted orders to his gang, his voice hoarse with anger. "Don't let them get away. They won't escape this time." Elias turned sharply, ducking into another alley. Nira followed closely, her instincts kicking in as she kept her back to the wall. They were almost running blind at this point, weaving through the streets of a city that seemed to grow more dangerous with every turn. The alley opened up onto a wider street, where a crowd of people moved about in a haze of conversations and traffic. Elias slowed their pace, blending in with the throngs of commuters, pretending to be just another pair of strangers. Nira stiffened at the contact, but she didn't resist. They had no choice. She could feel their pursuers close behind, their footsteps growing louder as they closed in. The brute's gang was relentless, and they knew these streets better than Elias did. As they walked, Elias kept his eyes forward, scanning the crowd. "Stay close," he muttered under his breath. "We'll lose them in the crowd." Nira's mind raced. She didn't trust this man, but for now, he was her best chance at survival. She had been through enough in her life to know when to rely on someone, even if she didn't want to. "Where are we going?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she wanted an answer. "To a safe house," Elias replied. His tone was even, detached. "We'll regroup there." Nira didn't ask any more questions. She didn't have the energy for it. What mattered now was staying alive, and Elias seemed to have a plan, one that might just work. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change, and that the man beside her might hold the key to her future. As they entered another side street, the sounds of the city faded, replaced by the low hum of distant machinery and the occasional hiss of steam from nearby vents. Elias stopped suddenly, his body tense, his hand resting lightly on Nira's arm. She froze, instinctively sliding into a defensive stance, her sharp eyes darting to the shadows around them. At the end of the alley, the brute's gang appeared, moving swiftly toward them. The brute himself, now close enough to be seen clearly, wore a malicious grin. He was determined, unyielding. "You made a mistake, stranger," he growled, his voice thick with venom. Nobody crosses me and gets away with it. Elias exhaled, his gaze never wavering. He pulled the blaster from his belt, its sleek black surface gleaming in the dim light. "I'm not here to talk," he muttered, his fingers tightening around the grip. The brute's laughter echoed in the alley, a deep, mocking sound. "You think that little toy will save you?" he sneered, cracking his knuckles. His gang members spread out, preparing to surround them. Elias didn't respond. Instead, he fired a shot into a nearby stack of crates, sending them crashing down with a loud bang. The gang paused, momentarily disoriented by the noise. The blaster shot had been calculated, not to kill, but to create confusion. The brute roared in anger, his rage boiling over. "You think a little trick like that will stop us?" he bellowed, his fists clenched tightly. "You're dead, both of you." But Elias didn't flinch. He raised the blaster again, aimed with cold precision. "I'm counting on it." Before the brute could charge, Elias activated a small device from his belt. A faint beep sounded, followed by a sharp crackle. The device sent out an electromagnetic pulse, disabling the gang's communication devices. For a moment, the alley was filled with the sounds of confusion as the gang members fumbled with their now useless tech. Nira couldn't help but feel a flicker of respect for the man beside her. He was smart, resourceful. "Nice trick," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and admiration. Elias gave a faint wry smile. "Old military surplus," he muttered. "Bought it off a junker a while back. Worth every credit." The gang wasn't done, though. The brute snarled, shaking his head. "You're not getting away, you pathetic little coward." Elias didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for Nira to follow him into a nearby side passage, hoping the narrow alleyways would slow their pursuers down. Nira hesitated for only a second before following, her heart racing as she realized just how close they were to getting away. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, she had hope. She could survive this. And maybe, just maybe, Elias wasn't the enemy she had first thought him to be. Into the heart of the city never slept. It pulsed with life, a constant hum that vibrated in the bones of its inhabitants. Elias and Nira slipped deeper into the veins of the metropolis, their footsteps quick but deliberate, each move calculated. The chase had not slowed down, but now, in the heart of the urban sprawl, it felt like they were moving through an entirely different world, one filled with layers of dangers and hidden allies. Nira's mind raced. The streets around them were chaotic, teeming with a mix of locals and travelers. People from all corners of the galaxy. The neon signs flickered like distant stars, casting colorful glows on the grimy sidewalks and towering structures. The hustle of the city was deafening. But to Nira, it was a mask. Beneath it all, she could feel the presence of the brute's gang, closing in with every passing moment. "I don't trust you," Nira said suddenly, her voice a mixture of suspicion and frustration. She was surprised by her own bluntness, but the words were out before she could stop them. "You might have bought my freedom, but I'm not some charity case." Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't slow his pace, though. "I never said I was," he replied simply. "Just doing what I can to make things right." Nira shot him a skeptical look. His words held weight, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he had his own agenda, something beyond just rescuing her. No one helped someone else without expecting something in return, especially in a place like this. "We're not out of danger yet," Elias added, sensing her growing distrust. "We need to keep moving." Nira didn't reply, but she quickened her pace, moving closer to Elias. She had been a captive long enough to know that trust was a fragile thing, and she wasn't ready to hand it over to someone she barely knew. Still, Elias had been the only one to offer her an escape, and for now, that was enough. The alley they entered was narrower, its walls pressed tightly against each other. Steam hissed from vents along the ground, and the faint scent of oil mixed with something sharper. Burning metal, perhaps. As they moved deeper, Nira noticed that the atmosphere changed. The streetlights above flickered, casting long, jagged shadows. This wasn't the bustling part of the city where people walked without a care. This was the underbelly, where the unwanted and the dangerous lurked. "Where are we going?" Nira asked, her voice more cautious now. She couldn't see their destination, only the maze of alleys and dead ends that seemed to stretch on forever. "A safe house," Ilias answered again, his voice low. "A place to regroup. I'm not about to let those idiots catch us so easily." Nira raised an eyebrow. Safe house. It was a term used by anyone in the business of staying one step ahead of their enemies. Still, she didn't argue. She had no better plan. Besides, in this part of the city, staying hidden was the best option. Suddenly, a noise echoed in the distance, footsteps, heavy and hurried, growing louder with each passing second. The brute's gang had picked up the pace, no doubt realizing that Ilias and Nira were no longer running in a straight line. They had begun to weave through the city, taking unpredictable turns to lose their trail. Ilias stopped, his hand raised in a silent command. Nira froze, her eyes scanning the alley around them. The faint echo of the gang's footsteps grew closer. She could hear the brute's voice, his tone dripping with menace, barking orders at his crew. "Split up. Find them. They won't get away." Ilias pulled Nira into the shadows, pressing her against the cold stone wall. The only sound now was their breathing, quick and shallow. Nira's pulse raced in her ears as she realized just how close they were to being caught. One wrong move, and they'd be surrounded. "Stay still," Ilias whispered, "and don't make a sound." Nira nodded, holding her breath as the gang's footsteps grew nearer. The brute and his men were just around the corner now, their heavy boots clattering on the pavement. Nira could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. They could hear the gang members' voices as they passed by, searching the alleys, calling out to each other. "Where the hell did they go?" One of the gang members muttered, his voice low and impatient. "They couldn't have gotten far," the brute snarled. "Split up. If you find them, don't let them escape." Nira clenched her fists, every muscle in her body screaming to run, but Ilias held her firmly in place. His grip was surprisingly gentle but unyielding, as if he knew exactly how to control the situation. The seconds dragged on like hours, but slowly the sounds of the gang's pursuit faded away. The footsteps grew quieter, then disappeared entirely. Nira let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her body relaxing only slightly. Ilias lowered his hand, his eyes never leaving the street. "They're not far behind," he said quietly, "but we've bought ourselves some time." Nira didn't speak at first, still processing the close call. She glanced at Ilias, who had already begun moving again, his pace steady but urgent. There was something about the way he operated, calm, collected, like he knew the city like the back of his hand. As they turned a corner, Nira finally spoke again. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice a little softer now, though still cautious. "What do you get out of all this? You could have walked away." Ilias didn't answer immediately, but when he did, his voice was steady. "I've seen what happens when people like them are allowed to keep doing what they do. I've been on both sides of the law, but I don't want to be that guy anymore." Nira didn't reply, but the words lingered in her mind. Ilias had his reasons, and for now, that was enough for her. But as they moved deeper into the labyrinth of the city, Nira couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading straight into a storm that neither of them would be able to avoid forever. The city was full of dangers, and Ilias had just drawn them both into the heart of it. Shadows and secrets. The city stretched endlessly before them, a maze of alleys, rooftops, and dark corners where even the bravest rarely ventured. Ilias led the way through the winding paths, the streets growing quieter as they moved farther from the chaos. Nira's thoughts churned in her mind, a whirlwind of questions, distrust, and the overwhelming need to survive. Her eyes flicked to Ilias occasionally, trying to decipher the man who had become both her rescuer and her enigma. They had reached an old section of the city, one that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The buildings were dilapidated, their surfaces cracked and worn by years of neglect. Graffiti adorned the walls, remnants of a forgotten rebellion or a lost cause. The air here was thick with the scent of dampness and rust, but there was something else too: secrecy. This was the kind of place that didn't show up on tourist maps, the kind of place that only those in the know could find. Elias stopped in front of a rundown door at the base of an old building. He glanced over his shoulder at Nira, his face stoic as always. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "Stay close." Nira hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her mind. This was a far cry from the safer, bustling parts of the city. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Was this truly a safe house, or had Elias led her into a trap? She followed him inside without another word, her instincts telling her to stay alert. The door creaked loudly as Elias pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The walls were bare, except for a few pieces of old furniture, couches, chairs, and a table that had seen better days. The air inside was cool, almost cold, with a faint metallic tang. This wasn't a place for comfort, but it didn't need to be. It was a place to lay low, to plan, to rest for a while before the next move. Elias locked the door behind them, securing it with a series of clicks that echoed in the silence. As the sound died down, he finally spoke. "We're safe for now, but we can't stay long. We're too exposed here." Nira's eyes scanned the room, but her mind was elsewhere. The near miss with the gang had rattled her more than she cared to admit. She hadn't expected the pursuit to be so relentless. It was clear now that they weren't just chasing her to recapture her. They were hunting for something. What exactly, she couldn't say. But it was more than just the credits they'd paid for her at the auction. "Why did you bid on me?" Nira asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "What did you really want?" Elias turned, his gaze steady but not cold. He seemed to weigh her question for a moment before answering, his voice slow but sure. "I didn't buy you for what you are, Nira. I bought you because I've seen the kind of people who profit off others' suffering. And I've seen what happens when they get too comfortable, when they think they can do whatever they want without consequence." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who can make a difference, one life at a time." Nira stared at him, unsure of what to make of his words. Was it really that simple for him? One life at a time. For someone like her, a prisoner for as long as she could remember. That notion felt almost alien. "That's not enough," she muttered, more to herself than to Elias. "Not for people like me." Elias didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved across the room and set a small case on the table. He opened it carefully, revealing a series of small devices and tools, things she recognized from her time as a slave. Tools for breaking and entering, for hacking into systems, for escaping. "We can't stay here for long," he said, his voice low again. "I've set up a few things to help us get out of this mess, but we need to keep moving. The brute will come for us, and when he does, he won't be alone." Nira watched him for a moment, trying to piece everything together. Something about his actions, the urgency in his movements, the way he meticulously checked each of the devices, told her he wasn't just a simple mercenary. There was a history here, something darker that lingered in the corners of his past. "Who are you really?" she asked, her voice quieter now, tinged with curiosity. "What's your story, Elias?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set to work, his hands moving swiftly as he activated a small screen on one of the devices. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, casting shadows across his features. For a moment, Nira saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something buried deep, something he wasn't ready to share. "I'm not the person I used to be," Elias said finally, his voice quieter now. "The man you see before you isn't the one who joined the military. He's not the one who fought in wars and made decisions that cost lives. That man is gone. Nira studied him. She could see it in his eyes, the haunted look of someone who had seen too much, someone who had crossed lines they could never uncross. She didn't ask for more. Some things weren't meant to be shared. Not yet. Instead, she turned her attention back to the table. "How do we get out of here?" she asked, her voice firm again. There was no time for softness. The danger was too real, too close. They needed a plan. Elias finished working with the device and looked up at her. His face was serious now, his earlier detachment replaced by something sharper. "There's an exit, a way out of the city. But it's not going to be easy. The gang will be looking for us in every corner. We'll need to use every trick we have to get through." He walked toward a wall and pressed a hidden panel, revealing a narrow passage. It led underground, through tunnels known only to those who lived in the city's darkest corners. Nira felt a chill run down her spine. This was it, the escape she had longed for, but it was also the beginning of something she couldn't control. As she stepped forward, following Elias down the darkened path, she couldn't help but wonder, was freedom truly possible, or was it just another illusion, one that would slip away just when she thought she had it? The darkness ahead felt oppressive, like it held all the secrets of the city. And now it was holding her future. Beneath the surface, the underground tunnels stretched out before them, a hidden labyrinth carved into the very bones of the city. The faint hum of machinery and distant echoes of city life above seemed like another world entirely, far removed from the cold, damp walls of the passage they now traversed. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and oil, a stark contrast to the neon-lit chaos above. As they moved deeper into the heart of the city's forgotten infrastructure, Nira couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving civilization behind, slipping further into the shadows. Elias led the way, his steps sure and steady, his face set with determination. The light from his small handheld torch flickered against the stone walls, casting strange, distorted shadows that seemed to dance around them. Nira followed close behind, her senses heightened, every footstep echoing louder in her ears. The silence of the tunnels was unnerving, except for the occasional hiss of steam or the distant rattle of pipes. It felt like they were the only two people left in the world. "This is where you hide?" Nira asked, her voice low as she glanced around, trying to make sense of the winding tunnels that stretched endlessly in every direction. "This is your big escape plan?" Elias didn't answer at first. He kept moving, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "It's not about hiding," he said finally. "It's about making sure they can't find us. At least, not without a fight." Nira didn't know what to make of that. She had been on the run long enough to know that any plan, no matter how well crafted, was only as good as the person executing it. And right now, all she had to go on was a man with a haunted past and a path that led into the city's deepest corners. They passed through a series of narrow passageways, each one darker and more claustrophobic than the last. Nira's breath caught in her chest as they turned another corner and found themselves standing at the entrance to an abandoned underground facility. The metal doors were rusted shut, but Elias seemed to know exactly what to do. He approached them with the calm precision of someone who had been here before, his fingers dancing over a hidden panel. The doors groaned open with a sharp, protesting sound. Behind the doors lay a sprawling room filled with old equipment and abandoned supplies. It was clear that no one had used this place in years, maybe decades. Rusted crates piled high, old tech gathering dust in the corners, and broken monitors blinked faintly in the dim light. It looked like a forgotten relic from a bygone era, left behind by those who had no use for it anymore. Elias stepped inside, gesturing for Nira to follow. "This is where we regroup. It's not much, but it'll do for now." Nira hesitated before stepping in, her eyes scanning the room. It was eerie, like walking into the remnants of a ghost town. The walls were lined with broken machinery, tools that had seen better days, and the remnants of what used to be. It felt like they were surrounded by memories. Memories of people long gone, of battles fought and lost. "Why are we here?" Nira asked, her voice betraying a hint of frustration. She wasn't sure if she trusted this place. It felt like a trap, like they were heading straight into a corner that couldn't be undone. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to one of the old control panels at the far side of the room. He pulled up a chair and began working, his hands moving with practiced ease over the worn buttons and switches. He muttered to himself as he worked, clearly focused. "The tunnels are our best shot," he said after a moment, not looking up. "But they're not a long-term solution. We'll need supplies, and we'll need a way to get out of the city once the heat dies down." Nira crossed her arms, watching him. "And you think this place is going to help us do that?" Elias finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not here to make promises, but I am here to make sure you get out, and I'm going to make sure you have a chance." Nira didn't respond. She wasn't sure how to react to his words. Was he sincere? Or was this all just part of some bigger plan she couldn't yet see? As Elias continued to work, Nira wandered around the room, her curiosity getting the better of her. She ran her fingers across the dusty surfaces, examining the abandoned equipment. There were weapons stored in some of the crates, old uniforms in another corner. It was clear this place had once been important, used by someone, maybe a faction or a group that had since faded into obscurity. Suddenly, a loud beep broke the silence. Elias stood up quickly, his face serious. He moved over to a console in the corner, where a small screen flickered to life. He typed in a few commands, his fingers flying over the keys with practiced ease. The screen flashed green, then red, then green again. Nira watched, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is that?" she asked, her voice sharp with anxiety. Elias didn't look up from the screen. "It's a security system. A backup I set up a while ago. It's designed to keep unwanted visitors out, but I'm betting it's going to work in our favor now." The screen flickered again, this time displaying a map of the city. Lines and symbols appeared, marking areas Elias had mapped out: routes, safe houses, and escape points. Nira's gaze narrowed as she took it all in. "This is how you plan to escape?" she asked, a little breathless. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He was still studying the map, but his silence was enough of an answer for Nira. He had been here before, perhaps even orchestrated this entire setup. This wasn't just a man trying to survive. This was someone who had fought ahead, who had prepared for a time when escape wouldn't be a choice. And now she was tangled in his web. For a brief moment, Nira felt a pang of doubt. Was she simply a pawn in his game? Or was Elias really on her side? Could she trust him? "I didn't bring you here for nothing," Elias said, his voice steady. "I'll get you out of this, Nira, but you need to keep your head in the game. They're coming, and they're not going to stop until they find us." Nira's fingers tightened around her arm, her mind racing. She had survived for so long on her own, never trusting anyone. And now she was caught in a web of choices she couldn't control. The Brute's gang was still hunting them, and with each passing moment, the noose tightened. There was no going back now. Elias's eyes met hers once more. "We've got one shot. Don't waste it." Nira nodded, her resolve hardening. She had no choice but to follow. Together, they were going to have to face what came next, even if the price of survival was higher than either of them expected. The edge of the unknown. The low hum of the underground facility was constant, almost soothing, but the tension in the air was anything but calm. Elias and Nira stood in the middle of the dimly lit room, the map still glowing faintly on the screen before them. Outside, the city continued to pulse, unaware of the two fugitives plotting their escape. But deep within the heart of the city's forgotten veins, Nira knew they were running out of time. The gang was closing in, their pursuit relentless. Elias moved quickly, grabbing a set of old, weathered backpacks from one of the crates lining the walls. "We need to go." "Now," he said, his voice urgent. "The brute and his crew are regrouping. They've got access to the city's cameras. We don't have long before they pick up our trail again." Nera felt a jolt of unease. She had known that their escape wouldn't be easy, but now, in the thick of it, the weight of their situation felt heavier. They were like rats in a maze, darting from shadow to shadow, with nowhere to hide for long. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice low and tight. She didn't want to admit it, but the doubt was creeping in again. Every step they took felt like they were racing towards something they couldn't control. "There's a passage," Elias said as he packed a few essentials into the bag. "Food, water, a few tools, and a small weapon. It'll lead us to the lower districts. After that, we take a shuttle to the outer rim. I've arranged for a ride, but it's risky." Nera felt her pulse quicken. The outer rim, the lawless zones where the weak were consumed by the strong. Elias was talking about escape, but the kind of escape that required more than just running. It would mean disappearing, leaving behind everything she had known. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. "Risky how?" she asked, stepping closer to him as he cinched the straps of the bag tighter. Elias didn't meet her gaze immediately. "It's not just the gang," he said quietly. "There are people who don't want us to leave this city. People who will make sure we don't. The higher-ups, the ones who pull the strings behind all this. They'll be watching every exit, every route. If we get caught now, we won't get another chance." The gravity of his words settled over Nera like a thick blanket. She had been on the run before, always fighting for survival. But this was different. The very system that had enslaved her, that had auctioned her off like a piece of meat, was now hunting her down. Nera took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Then let's not get caught." Elias looked up at her, his expression softened by a flicker of respect. "That's the spirit. But we're not out of the woods yet. The real fight starts now." With one last glance at the map and the blinking red dots that marked their position, Elias turned and moved toward the back of the facility, pushing aside a rusted metal door. Nera followed, her feet light despite the weight of her thoughts. As the door creaked open, a cool breeze hit her face, carrying with it the scent of the distant streets above. The tunnel beyond was narrow, carved from stone and metal. It wound its way deeper, an underground artery meant to connect the city's forgotten sectors to its darker heart. The further they went, the more oppressive the air felt, as though the very walls were closing in on them. Every step echoed through the silence, an unnerving reminder that they were still being hunted. "Stay close," Elias muttered, glancing over his shoulder as he led the way. Nera nodded, but her eyes were scanning the darkness, her senses on high alert. She had learned to trust her instincts in these moments, and they were screaming at her now. Something was off. The walls seemed to vibrate with an unsettling hum, and the faintest rustling sounds came from ahead, though no one else was visible. Elias paused, his hand held up in a silent signal to stop. He crouched low, listening intently. Nera mirrored his movements, her eyes narrowing as she strained to hear. A faint click echoed from the far end of the tunnel, followed by a soft hiss. Elias cursed under his breath. "Trap," he muttered. Before Nera could ask what he meant, a series of automated doors slammed shut ahead of them, trapping them in the narrow tunnel. The sudden noise reverberated off the walls, making Nera's heart race. She could hear the distant sounds of heavy boots, footsteps coming from both directions. "They've already been here," Elias said, his voice tight with urgency. "We're in their sights." Nera's mind raced as she instinctively reached for the blaster at her side. She hadn't used it much, but in moments like this, she was thankful for the training she had received before her capture. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic bubbling up inside her. Elias scanned the tunnel, his eyes darting from side to side. "We fight our way through. Stay low and follow me." They didn't have time to argue. The sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder, and Nera's grip on her blaster tightened. She knew what was coming, an ambush. There would be no mercy for them. Not in this part of the city. Elias led the way, pulling her behind a large stack of old crates as the first wave of attackers rounded the corner. They were soldiers, no doubt sent by the higher-ups to clean up the mess left behind by the auction house. Elias moved quickly, his blaster coming to life in a swift, deadly arc. A shot rang out, followed by another, as he took down the first attacker. But more were coming, too many for them to handle head-on. Naira's pulse surged as she moved, her body moving on instinct as she aimed and fired. The energy from the blast sent a sharp crack through the air, but the first attacker didn't fall. His body was covered in armor designed to withstand such blasts. Elias cursed again. "We can't stay here. We need to get to the next exit." Naira nodded, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The walls of the city were closing in. The fight for her freedom was no longer just about escaping the auction house. It was about surviving long enough to find her way out of a city that would rather see her dead than free. With a shared, unspoken resolve, they'd fought their way forward, every step taking them closer to the unknown.